Hello everyone, welcome across Australia to this webinar organised by the Clayton Utz Perth Reconciliation Action Plan Committee. My name is Simon Taskunis, I'm a partner here at Clayton Utz. The title of our panel session today is A First Nations Voice Anchored in Our Constitution. What might this look like? Why have we chosen this topic to discuss today? Well, Clayton Utz proudly supports the 2017 Uluru Statement from the Heart. This was a national indigenous consensus position on constitutional reform to recognise indigenous Australians. 12 months ago, today's panellists participated in a session in Perth entitled How Can Our Constitution Guarantee that Indigenous Voices are Heard by Parliament? That topic was chosen because the Uluru Statement calls for the establishment of a First Nations voice enshrined in Australia's Constitution. The Uluru Statement did not contain details of how this voice would work and what a constitutional amendment might look like. Our former Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull and current PM Scott Morrison both ruled out one option for reform that would have seen a national voice enshrined in our Constitution. And in the past year, the federal government's Indigenous voice co-design process has been underway, developing options and models for how local, regional and national Indigenous voices can be heard on matters that affect them. The Senior Advisory Group delivered its interim report to the federal government last month, which is yet to be made public. Our panellists today will explore what we can expect to see from that report, how Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australians can expect to be engaged in the conversation about the voice in the months ahead, and what a proposed amendment to the Constitution might look like, which will be put to Australian voters at a referendum. So, to introduce our panellists today, seated beside me here in another sunny, warm day in Perth is Carol Innes. Carol's a Noongar woman and is the co-chair of Reconciliation WA. Carol's also the manager of Aboriginal Cultural Heritage and Arts at Development WA, the WA State Government's Land Development Agency. And Carol also sits on the board of the Art Gallery of WA. Welcome back, Carol.
Thanks, Simon.
Also, Sean Gordon, who is dialing in from Newcastle today. Sean is a Wangkumara Barkinji man. He is Managing Director of the Gidji Group, and he's also Chair of Uphold and Recognise. Gidji Group's a 100% Indigenous-owned business, and Uphold and Recognise is an Indigenous-led think tank, non-profit organisation that promotes discussion of how we can recognise Indigenous Australians without disturbing the way the Australian Constitution works. Welcome back, Sean. And
thank you, Simon.
Finally,
and hello, Carol.
And finally,
thanks, Sean. And
finally, Damien Freeman. Damien is a writer, lawyer and philosopher. He's currently a visiting fellow at the PM Glynn Institute at the Australian Catholic University. Together with Julian Lisa MP, he founded Uphold and Recognise. Welcome back, Damien.
Thanks, good to be back.
So before we commence our discussion with the panel, I'd like to invite Carol Innes to deliver the welcome to country.
Thank you, Simon. Nyanjur Pranija Wajak Nama Buja, Nyanjur Pranija Nunu Buja, Knitting, Nyanjur Pran Wanging, Ni, Nunu, Nyan. I'm happy to be sitting here with you on Wajak Nunga Buja. Happy to be where you are, from your country, to be sitting and listening today. So I hope that we have a good conversation together. It's coming out toward the end of the year, and I hope that everyone's feeling a lot stronger. Where we all sit together on the topic we think about today is really front of head and heart today. With the big thing that I need to do this afternoon, my head is gone there already. But thank you for being a part of today's conversation.
Thank you very much, Carol, for that. Before I commence some questions to the panel, can I encourage everyone who's dialed into this webinar to submit any questions that you might have via the question button throughout the session, and we'll then answer your questions towards the end of this session. So to kick off the discussion with the panel today, Carol, if I could turn to you first. In a recent interview with Professor Fiona Stanley, she stated that because Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people took control to protect their communities in response to COVID-19, that their communities are doing better than almost any other in the world when it comes to resisting the spread of the deadly coronavirus. What do you think this experience demonstrated about governments listening to Indigenous people?
I can talk from a first-hand experience working here in WA with many of our Aboriginal organisations, bringing them together to work in a collective. Everyone was a bit stilted by what they were experiencing, and we all came together to think about how we could do this better, which I think was the first time that everyone reacted and responded in a really positive way to put the care packages into play. The biggest part of the shift I saw was the way that government responded to our space here in the city in Perth, and working with that whilst managing the whole state. So they left a lot of the mechanics to us to deliver on the ground, and worked with us for that, and even contacting some of the regional and more remote centres. People said, we're going bush. We are out of here. We will leave the towns and we'll look after ourselves. And I think that's what people did. They knew that they were responsible for themselves in the way that they always are in something like this, and keeping the supply of food and to them, and all others, the medical support that was done as well. I think it was a different way of working, which I hope that it could be the normal way of working into the future. So a lot of our people had the knowledge to look after themselves. Many of those who needed medical support knew how to get that. So I think a lot of what came from this is that give us the opportunity to manage our lives. And I think that is a big learning point that we all need to consider in regard to this big conversation around the voice and the voice to Parliament. It showed that we can take responsibility for our lives. We can take responsibility to manage in the panic that happened. And a big part of what we were really quite mindful of is that the people were frightened, our old people were frightened to go shopping because of the mass, the hordes that were going in to take, the mass shopping that they were doing, and people were too frightened to go out. So we worked at ways of doing that collectively, not just only with ourselves, but the way that some of the big store giants worked with us, which was really quite an amazing opportunity at the time, and negotiating with some of the corporates who were funding some of these agencies of delivery to quarantine. It was in the word that we could do, food for our people to have that rather than having to go through the mainstream process. So that was a really good response, but it also saw the loopholes of what our mob deal with as well. So I mean, I can talk about that from that was here in WA and working up and down WA because I was in on not really quite a hot spot. It changed. We thought outside of ourselves as those working together, and I think it demonstrated that given the opportunity that we are able to take on board major decisions to deal with what we've dealt with and seeing the outcome that we've seen.
Mm. So I guess to some non-Indigenous Australians, is it an example of how Indigenous voices have brought local knowledge and really an extraordinary ability to meet challenges?
Yeah, I think it demonstrated too that in our mob look after each other and care for each other, and I think that demonstrated that. But one of the things that happened inside of this, in the pandemic, many people who were ill were not taking up their hospital appointments, so there was a little bit of concern around how they were being, their medication supply and their hospital care or checkups were being dealt with, but they just refused to leave their homes. And what happened through that process is that there were other partnerships formed with mainstream care providers in medical support to travel to people's homes and deliver that. So the response was quite amazing. I mean, if we did it all over again and showed how it was done a lot through our network and the way that we worked with each other.
Mm. Yeah. Great. Thanks, Carol, for that insight. Sean, if I can turn to you. 2 years ago, the federal government oversaw a joint select committee on constitutional recognition, which reported on the Uluru Statement's proposal for constitutional recognition and a First Nations voice to Parliament. Then last year, Federal Minister for Indigenous Australians Ken White announced a co-design process to develop models to enhance local and regional decision making and to provide a voice for Indigenous Australians to government. Despite the impact of COVID-19 this year, which Carol's given some good insights into, the senior advisory group delivered its interim report to the federal government last month. Sean, what can you tell us about the co-design process and what, from where you've been sitting, has it involved to date?
Yeah, thank you, Simon, and thank you, Carol, for that welcome to country. I'd too like to acknowledge country and acknowledge your people over there in WA, and acknowledge those many people and the many nations that each of you are on today on this call. You know, it's interesting, the co-design process, that when they put it in place, that it was immediately restricted in regards to the terms of reference that was put in place for the committees to be able to do their role. The most important aspect in regards to the Uluru Statement was an enshrined voice in the Constitution. Interesting enough, the co-design process the government deliberately left that out of the co-design process. And so what was established really was a terms of reference for a national co-design group. There were two bodies set up, a national co-design group and a local and regional co-design group, to look at models to create a voice at local and regional levels and a voice at a national level, without any consideration for whether or not this voice would be enshrined or anchored in the Constitution. You know, as a part of the work that Uphold and Recognise do it in this place, you know, we believe that that's fundamentally flawed within the process, because the Uluru Statement clearly asks for voice, treaty and truth-telling, but asks for the voice to be enshrined in the Constitution to ensure that we add certainty and safeguards in place to ensure that you know, that whatever structure is put up isn't able to be abolished by governments into the future. And so, you know, so it was quite disappointing to first of all know that that's the process in which the consultation around co-design was going to take place. Because I think it's difficult to then consider how you power a voice, how you give power to a local voice, a regional voice, a state and national voice, and give it the certainties and the protections for it to be able to properly and effectively do its job. And so for me, the focus really was around how do we identify structures that give voice to local communities. And surprisingly, this is not a new concept. There are many structures right now that have been operating and existing right across the country for many years. There are the old COAG trials that had voices. There's in some states they've got local decision making. They've got empowered community structures and so on. I think with some research that was done by the federal government, there were over 200 different regional governance structures that already exist in the country right now. So the challenge when you're looking at co-design is that how do you then ensure that you can plug each of those structures into a single power board, for instance, into a single power board that gives power to those voices, but also allows those voices to interact with governments at all levels, and for governments to interact with those voices at all levels. And without knowing the full detail of the report, I look forward to it coming out. But I will reinstate and reinforce that without addressing the anchoring of the voice within the Constitution, what the government have done to date in regards to the co-design is only one aspect of what the Uluru Statement asked for. And I think that, people right across the country and those people that clearly support an Indigenous voice need to be continually advocating to the Minister and to the Prime Minister and to other politicians that we must ensure that the voice is anchored in the Constitution.
Yeah, that's good, Sean. Damien, have you got any insights? I believe throughout the year you've had some interaction with government and uphold and recognise as in relation to the co-design process. Have you got any comments to make about that, just following on from what Sean's just said?
Look, I think the main thing I would say, I agree entirely with Sean about what the Uluru Statement called for, and it called for something that was going to be in the Constitution, and we've got a process now that is not dealing with the Constitution at all. I think the important thing to remember is there was a joint select committee that was chaired by Senator Patrick Dodson and Julian Leeser MP, and they were the ones who called for this co-design process. And the basis for calling for it was that before you can talk about putting something in the Constitution, you need to know what it is that you're talking about putting in the Constitution. In other words, so there was more work. Their inquiries said there's more work that needs to be done to understand what this is going to look like. And, we are waiting for this report now to come out for the Minister to release it, and we understand that it will contain a number of options for what a local voice might look like, what a regional voice might look like, what a national voice might look like, and that those options can then be put to Indigenous communities and the wider Australian community for feedback so that we can get some clarity around what it would look like. But I think, as Sean has emphasised, that really is just the preliminary step for us then to remind the government that it promised that at the end of this process, it would revisit the question of whether this goes in the Constitution, and if so, when we have a referendum, and what words we might insert into the Constitution. So that's, I think, where we're at the moment.
And Simon, just adding on to what Damien has said, Simon, is that Minister Ken White, has indicated at the moment that they would look towards legislating a voice. but he hasn't committed to the next step, which is anchoring a voice in the Constitution.
Yeah, which is an important point. And I can see some good questions coming through from Ashley about the voice, which we'll ask just after we've asked the panel a few more questions, because what we're going to discuss will touch on some of what these questions are asking. But just, Carol, just following on from what Sean and Damien have said about the co-design process, it seems like we don't know yet what the recommended model for the voice is, but that there will be further feedback sought from Indigenous Australians when the government lands on a particular model and presumably announces that. What type of feedback do you expect Noongar people to give, or in fact have already given, to the co-design process about what this voice means to them and what it should look like?
I think for me personally, it becomes a bit of a cart before the horse idea, where a lot of this is a legislative space, but what we're looking for is a recognition space. And I know it's, that in what we've dealt with for so long, we've had representative bodies, and we've had a different structure. We've had, the ANZIC model that was set up, but we've got the regional organisations and land councils and language groups and cultural centres, all providing the cultural knowledge and support already for their regional space, for their local space. But I think what is missed out in a lot of this is in urban settings where not a lot of this is a cohesive collect, and it's many people in one place. So setting up a structure and the co-design modelling is around service delivery and how people are responding and needing a lot of that. But I think for nation's sake, and for nationhood and recognition for our people, it as a collective and as unique to all country in Australia, I think the missing part is the rule, and I think it's the Constitution is the rule. And you can create all these different entities and different process, but unless the rule is there, and I think if the rule is there, it gives opportunity for the bipartisan approach that we need from both levels of all parties of government to allow us to be involved in decision making, policy making, whatever it affects our people, because we've seen too much of a disconnect.
Yeah.
And I think even in the co-design modelling, a big part of co-design comes, where's the budgets coming from? Do we have co-design decisions around budgets? Because that's a big part of this as well, So we can make many decisions we like, but who designs the budget that allows all these policies to be enacted, or programs, or the way it'll come to the people? I just feel that the time is coming closer, and we've got to be really courageous. So courageous leadership has to prevail in this space. And we all know who we are, but I think what's happening is that this isn't all about driving us apart. It's about a more inclusive that the nation needs to understand. That was that exclusion when that constitution was developed. We were excluded as people, And I think we've got to deal with that first, because no matter how far we go, and we've come a long way.
Well, it's a historical fact.
It's got to change.
No Indigenous Australians participated in the
decision.
constitutional conventions in the 1890s,
Yes.
nor were they given a vote on the adoption of our constitution. So there's somewhat of an anomaly there. But if I can pick up, one of the points you made was the importance of the rule or the constitutional side of this. And I'll turn to you, Damien, about this, because you've done a lot of work in this space over the course of this year and before that. We know that there was one model of the voice that was rejected by this government and the previous one, and that was where it was characterised as potentially being a third chamber of Parliament. So now we see this Indigenous voice at all levels of government being proposed. My question to you is, if the senior advisory group co-designs a recommended model for an Indigenous voice which has broad community and political support, is it important that this model be referred to or written into or anchored in our constitution? And why is it important, from your perspective, to have this constitutional recognition?
Okay, look, I think Carol has really answered the question in 2 words when she talks about the rule. It is about the rule. Let's just remember how we got to this point. We're having a process now to co-design what a voice might look like. Why are we doing that? Basically because in 2007, John Howard said if he was re-elected, he would have constitutional recognition. He'd have a referendum on constitutional recognition of the Indigenous people, and every Prime Minister since then committed to that. So we started talking about this idea we're going to recognise these people in the Constitution. Then we start saying, well, if we're going to recognise the people in the Constitution, what would it mean to recognise them? And then people say, well, actually, maybe we should ask the Indigenous people what they think it means. And that's really what the Uluru Statement is. The Uluru Statement is when the point at which the Indigenous people from around Australia come together and speak with one voice to say what they think it means for their peoples to be recognised in the Constitution, and they say it's about recognising a First Nations voice in the Constitution. They don't just say we need a voice, they say we need it needs to be in some sense in the Constitution. Why? And you ask me, why is it important why isn't it enough that we just set it up and it works? And I think the answer to that is this idea of the rule. The Constitution of the Commonwealth of Australia is what I like to call a practical and pragmatic charter of government. Those are the words that Justice Scalia used to describe the American Constitution. I think it's even more true of the Australian Constitution. It is a rule book. It sets out the rules according to which the country is governed. And if we admit that there's a problem here that needs to be addressed, then we need to acknowledge that we have to have a rule that requires something to be done here, right? There needs to be a rule. The Australian people need to tell the government and the parliament through a referendum that there is an obligation to ensure that Indigenous voices are heard, right? It's not enough that the government of the day or the parliament of the day feels magnanimous and feels like hearing the voices. It's that there's an obligation to make sure they're heard, that there's a rule that they must be heard. And the other side of that is it doesn't solve all the problems. It won't. We all know, and the Uluru Statement recites how complex the problems of Indigenous life in Australia are today. We all know that that will not go away overnight if we have a referendum. But what it will do is it will give Indigenous people reason to believe that the future will be different from the past. It will give Indigenous people reason to believe that their voices will be heard when decisions are made about Indigenous affairs, because the Constitution commands that the Commonwealth must hear those voices. And that really does change the dynamic and does give Indigenous people reason to feel confident that although things won't change their problems will not be solved overnight, but they've got reason to believe then that things will be done differently in future. And that's why I think it's really important that we do need to commit ourselves to one more rule in the rule book, a rule that the Commonwealth must hear the Indigenous voices in Indigenous affairs.
Yeah, good. And in terms of that one more rule, helpfully, Professor Anne Toomey from Sydney Uni's recently proposed some relatively simple language, which we've had up on the screen for a few minutes. And this is just a proposal to insert into the Constitution, to impose that obligation on the Commonwealth that Damon, you were discussing, to ensure Indigenous voices are heard by the Commonwealth, but importantly, leaving it to the federal parliament and the government with flexibility about how to achieve it. Damien, what's your view about this proposed wording, and do you think the government is open to discussing an insertion along these lines? Okay, so look.
So Damien, before you answer Simon's question, Simon, what I wanted to just quickly touch on is that to be able to move forward with the solution, we've got to make sure that we clearly understand the problem. And the problem right now is about Indigenous disempowerment. It is about government spending $34 billion in the space with no clear accountability or transparency or understanding of the outcomes of that $34 billion expenditure. It's about the Rio Tinto destruction of Gulpen Gorge. It's about all of these things that happen right across our nation, where Indigenous people have very little say and very little input into how these decisions get made about us. When we think about policies, programs, funding at all levels of government, and other people making decisions on behalf of our people, communities, in remote communities, and not having a clear understanding as to how those decisions will impact those communities in the long run. And, so that once we then understand, the torment of our powerlessness, you then got to start to work for a structure that develops systems, systemic change, structural change, and so on, that gives power to those people to be able to then start to take ownership and responsibilities for the things that we are responsible for. The problem with the relationship at the moment between Indigenous government is government overreach into our lives, and well and truly overreach into our lives from the day that we're born until the day in which we die. What we're saying to government is, you need to step out of our lives. We know what the solutions are, but we need to ensure that the structures and the systems of this Western, this Western system properly recognises our rightful place within our own countries, so that we can then start to take carriage of the things that we're responsible for. So that's understanding the problem, and what Damon and what we're trying to work towards now through the work of Uphold and Recognise and many others is to try and come up with some of those solutions. Sorry, Damien, I'll hand it back over to you.
Yeah, look, so I think that I agree has clarified a lot of what the problem is. I think there's no doubt that the government acknowledges that there is a problem and that there's a need to solve the problem, and I don't think the government would disagree with much of what Sean has said about what the problem is and how we go about solving it. We've got to be pragmatic now in terms of what it means to anchor this this voice in the Constitution. We've got a situation where Indigenous people have spoken with one voice in the Uluru Statement, right? And the Uluru Statement has called for a First Nations voice, and that this should be somehow enshrined in the Constitution. Now, let's just all be 100% clear about this. The Uluru Statement does not say what it means to enshrine this new thing in the Constitution, right? It just says we need a First Nations voice, and we need to, in some sense, it needs to be enshrined in the Constitution. That's all it says. It's an open question how we go about setting it up, what it's going to look like, and it's an open question how we're going to recognise it in the Constitution. That's not answered by the Uluru Statement, and it's not the case that Indigenous people have spoken with one voice about exactly what words should go in the Constitution. So on the one hand, we've got a very clear mandate from the Indigenous people in the Uluru Statement that we need to do this. On the other hand, we've got a very clear position from the government that whilst the government is committed to constitutional recognition, it has ruled out one specific model for doing that, right? It has been very clear. Malcolm Turnbull, when he was Prime Minister, was very clear. Scott Morrison subsequently has been very clear that the government will not establish in the Constitution a new representative assembly that is either that is based on race, in the sense that only the people of one race can be elected to it, or only the people of one race can vote for it. Now, I've been involved with this for a long time. I don't think that was what we were ever asking for, right? But we've got to be honest. One thing has been ruled out, and we have to accept that that one thing has been ruled out. So the question then becomes, well, look, can we find any common ground between the position in the Uluru Statement and the position in the government's response? And I think Anne Toomey has done a good job of that. She has found a way that we can anchor our commitment to hearing Indigenous voices in the Constitution without actually, without setting up in the Constitution a prescribed structure for a new body. So as you can see on the screen, she proposes a new section 127, and for what it's worth, she's labelled it 127 because it would replace the section that used to say that Aboriginal people could not be counted in the census. That was removed in 1967, and so she thought this would be an appropriate place to put the new requirement to show the new attitude. And I'll just read it to you. She says that we should put in the following words in the Constitution. The Commonwealth shall make provision for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples to be heard by the Commonwealth regarding proposed laws and other matters with respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander affairs, and the Parliament may make laws to give effect to this provision. So, if we were to do this, what we would do is we would see the electors, the people of Australia, giving a direction to the Commonwealth that it had an obligation to ensure that Indigenous voices are heard, and that they're heard in relation to proposed laws and other matters. So that's Parliament and the government should hear it. And it leaves it to the Parliament to decide how to do this. This, I believe, is a fair way of trying to find common ground between what the Uluru Statement called for. It called for a commitment in the Constitution that Indigenous voices would be heard, and common ground with the government, which has said we are not going to insert into the Constitution words that say there shall be a new entity that's, as they say, is based on race. So that's why I think Professor Toomey's given us a really helpful contribution. It's the basis for starting a conversation about how Indigenous people and the government might be able to come together and agree on some words that could anchor our commitment to hear Indigenous voices in the Constitution.
Amy, just on that, and because it was a good question that was sent through earlier, and maybe this is a good point to ask that question, is doing something like this, is this likely to create a wedge between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australians? And how does having a voice like this, how do you reconcile that with a representative government or representative democracy?
I mean, I think two initial comments I'd make here. One is we all basically agree that if people are going to be affected by a particular law, then those people should be consulted before the law is made, right? I mean, that's a basic idea that we all agree about. If the local council is going to approve a building in your street, a new home to be built, we all agree that the people in the street should be given the opportunity to be consulted about it and say what they think before the decision is made. Now, why would anyone think it should be different when it comes to Indigenous affairs, right? We all accept that the government needs to have power to make laws and policies in this area, right? We might disagree about them. We might disagree about what the law about native title should be. We might disagree about what the law about heritage protection should be, but we all agree that there do need to be some laws about native title and about the protection of sacred sites and these sorts of things. I mean, and I think we could all agree that the people who are affected by that ought to be consulted, right? That's nothing controversial in that, and there's no wedge to be divide people there. It's reasonable that when you're affected in a special way by a law, you should have an opportunity to engage, to offer a consultation, advice, to help draft the law that's going to affect you in a special way. And you say, well, why are the Indigenous people in a special case here? I mean, I think there are two things about that. One is we are in a situation where the Indigenous people are the only people for whom the Constitution gives the government and the Parliament the power to make special laws. That right? They are set apart because it is a fact that the government has used the racist power to make laws for Indigenous people. We can tidy up the racist power, but it's going to remain the case that they stand alone in the Constitution as the only group for whom the special laws are made. So I think it's entirely reasonable to say, well, if the Constitution is going to acknowledge that the government and the Parliament have to make laws and policies for this one group of people, then it also ought to acknowledge that in doing so, it should set in place a mechanism to make sure that these people are heard before the laws and policies are made. You know, that it's a special feature of Indigenous people that the government and the Parliament are always going to have to deal with this. Even if we address disadvantage completely, we'll always have native title, we'll always have heritage protection. This is a special feature. The other thing I think we all just have to be a bit grown up about and understand is this does go to the basis on which our country gets going. It goes to the basis of our history. You know, we can't pretend that the plight of Indigenous people in Australia today, as it's articulated in the Uluru Statement, does not come out of 200 years of history that does actually place our Indigenous cousins in a special situation. And, you know, we have to be a bit grown up about that, and we have to acknowledge that, you know, this is not about a wedge. It's not about creating a wedge between people. It's about acknowledging that the way this place was set up, if there's a wedge, it's our history that has allowed the wedge to be there, and we really need to be grown up and to acknowledge that and to find ways that we can move forward together. That doesn't mean giving these people special privileges, but it does mean acknowledging the history and acknowledging that we've got to make an appropriate accommodation, an accommodation that reflects our history.
Yeah.
And Simon, just following on from Damien, Simon, right now we don't have a wedge between us. We've got a the Grand Canyon between us. When we look at the disparity gaps, when we look at the incarceration gaps, when we look at the economic disparity, when we look at all of the issues facing Indigenous people, what we should be looking at in regards to this process of anchoring a voice in the Constitution and giving Indigenous people a say in affairs is a way of weaving our cultures together and about bringing our cultures together in a way that, Australians with a 200-year history can then tap into that 65,000 year history. We celebrate who we are as a nation, and that's I think the frustrating piece in all of this is that because of the way in which the Constitution was developed and because of the way in which it made special provisions for us and because we were left out in other ways, it's created a divide. It's created a divide, and what we're trying to do now through this process is rectify that problem to ensure that we then come together as a stronger nation where we can then connect into all of our cultures.
Let me just add one more comment about both the question and Sean's answer. I think we need to distinguish, and I think the question, it's fair to say, okay, I don't think the question was denying or was premised on the assumption that there wasn't a massive problem, a Grand Canyon division in Australia today between the position of Indigenous people and ordinary people, and the non-Indigenous people. I think what the question is getting at is, look, we don't want a wedge in the Constitution. We don't want to create a constitutional wedge. I think that's a fair enough thing to say, and I think we should be concerned not to do that. And I respect people who don't want to amend the Constitution in a way that would create a wedge in the Constitution. I think what Professor Toomey is showing, though, is there is a way that you can address this chasm, that the practical real problem, without creating a wedge in the Constitution. And that's what we have to open our minds to. We have to open our minds to how is it that we could put a rule in the Constitution that would not create a wedge. Because I can accept there will be some ways of doing this that might create a wedge. And I'm not saying we should go down that path. We need to open our minds to what are the ways we could do this that don't involve creating a new wedge in the Constitution.
Thanks. And look, it might be a good time to just go to one of the questions from one of the people attending. Does the draft section 127 go far enough? Would there be further amendments needed to the Constitution in the future to give effect to the Uluru Statement if Professor Toomey's amendment was made?
Look, I don't think anything more would be necessary in the Constitution because the Uluru Statement really is surprisingly modest. It calls for a Makarrata Commission. It calls for agreement making. It calls for truth telling. But it doesn't say anywhere that all these things need to be enshrined in the Constitution, right? It's a pretty small ask, the Uluru Statement, if you read it on its own terms. All it's saying, we do need a process that will give rise to all of this. And in order to do that, we need our voices to be heard. And we need the Constitution to make provision for our voices to be heard. But that's really all that the Uluru Statement says needs to be done in the Constitution. The Uluru Statement is very clear but there are a whole lot of things that need to be done, right? We do need agreements, we do need truth-telling, we do need a Makarrata Commission, but it doesn't say that any of that needs to be in the Constitution. And, you know, we should, I think, admire the humility of the Uluru Statement on this point. You know, it is not making the biggest possible ask. It is not, you know, it's not like some bargaining thing that you're going to bargain us down from this position. It's really making a very modest claim, which is just to say the starting point for anything in the future is that the Constitution itself must ensure that our voices are heard. And that, you know, that's not asking a lot, but if we could just get that in, I think it's fair to say that the rest of it could be dealt with through legislation. It doesn't need to be in the Constitution, and the Uluru Statement itself doesn't assume that it should be in the Constitution.
Another question from Christopher. I'd be interested to hear the panelist's views on the likelihood of a referendum to insert, for example, the proposed change to 127. What would be the likelihood of a referendum succeeding at this stage? Are there any preliminary polls that could indicate with reasonable accuracy how Australians are likely to vote, or is it too early?
Look, I'm happy to have a crack at that, Simon. There have been some polls done over a number of years now, and the polls come out indicating that 64% of Australians support Indigenous recognition, and I think that's important that happens. But I think the reality is when we look at our current the current political landscape at a national level, at the moment, Labor, Liberal, whatever way you vote, when we do go to the elections, they're very close. They're getting around 50% margins either way in regards to just how close these elections are, and which is why, importantly, from the work that I've recognised, is that we focus our efforts on bringing on the right of politics on this journey of Indigenous constitutional recognition. There are others out there that are working on the left, and there are others working in the centre to try and ensure that we're able to build momentum. But the work of Uphold and Recognise is specifically to work on the right of politics and to engage in conversations within Parliament and within that conservative space to ensure that group of people are at least aware of what it is Indigenous people are asking for and what it is they're seeking. The reality is, whether it's this government, whether it's a Labor government, if a Labor government were to get in, they've still got to convince the other side to support a referendum. So for me, I think everyone doing their piece of their work on either side of at either end of the politics, we then start to ensure some success as we move forward. There's also some really good campaigns out there that's been led by Dean Park and Thomas Mayer and others, and that people then need to engage in those campaigns, given as to where they feel comfortable in regards to where they engage in this conversation. But recent polls have indicated that more than 50% of Australians support Indigenous recognition. We haven't tested yet, I don't think, to the extent we need to, whether they would support anchoring a voice in the Constitution. Damien?
Yeah, look, I agree with that. It's true that the polls published in the Australian at the weekend say that the support is increasing. We know that it's always the case that in a referendum you start with support, and the more it's talked about, the lower the support goes. So it is always hard. I think Sean's right that although there is a relatively high level of in principle support for constitutional recognition, there's a difference between supporting something in principle and supporting a specific proposal. And I think, yes, a lot more work needs to be done to get to a point where people feel confident about a specific proposal. But let's also be honest that we don't have on the table at the moment a specific proposal that Indigenous people agree about and the government agrees about, and that, you know, that we can say to the Australian people, well, you know, how do you feel about this? So look, I feel optimistic. I think it's a reasonable thing we're asking for people. I think it's really quite modest what the Uluru Statement asked for. I think people of goodwill will support it, but yeah, as Sean says, we have to persuade people on both sides of politics and people who vote on both sides of politics, and there's still really quite a lot of work to be done to get to that point.
And in saying that, Simon, not all sides, whether you sit on the left or whether you, if you go to some of the farthest regions on the left, you will find that there are people that sit in that don't support the Uluru Statement, that don't support enshrining a voice in the Constitution and so on. As you will find when you get to the furthest regions of the right, you know, so there's at the very far ends of these, you know, these two spectrums between left and right, there are people that sit at both of those ends that just wouldn't support a way forward.
Yep, and just in the remaining minutes, a couple more questions. One from Ashley: is there any precedent for a voice like the one under discussion anywhere else in the world?
Well, I think the answer to that is yes. There are in Scandinavia. There's a First Nations voice. In Canada, they have arrangements for the Indigenous people there. Of course, in New Zealand, there's a quite special arrangement that's come out of the Treaty of Waitangi and the Waitangi Tribunal and the arrangements to have settlements with each of the tribes. So I think there are precedents around the world. I think the challenge is we have to understand that our situation is unique, and we need a unique solution that addresses both what's unique about the situation of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders. It's not as if their situation is the same as the situation of every Indigenous people around the world, and that also that our constitution is unique, and a solution needs to be sensitive to that, right? You know, that is a special feature of our system, that we have this constitution that can only be changed by a referendum. You know, there are a whole lot of things that it's a federation. There are a whole lot of things about the constitution itself that are unique, and it is a challenge. And I mean, we can draw on the experience overseas, but I think in the end we also need to say, well, given what's unique about the Indigenous experience in Australia, given what's unique about Australian constitutional law, how can we find some sort of common ground here between these competing sets of concerns that will allow us to find a unique solution that works in our situation?
The other difficulty, Simon, I was just going to say, the other difficulty in regards to comparing, in regards to doing the comparison to what's happening with other countries, is we need to continue to remind ourselves that Indigenous people only make up 3% of the population. So we're constantly at the whim of the 97% of non-Indigenous Australians to support whatever it is we're proposing to move forward. And that in itself is a fundamental difference. When you look at the Maori make up 18% of the population. You know, that there is power in 18%, being 18% of the population versus being 3%. You know, so we must always remember that Indigenous people are 3%, and in everything that we do in regards to programs, services, funding and so on, we're constantly battling the 97% to ensure that our voices are heard and that we're empowered and are able to take responsibilities for the things that we are responsible for.
I guess just in thinking about the Uluru Statement from the heart, people forgetting that it was a statement from the heart, but from our people in a consultation process that took years to get to be put on the table, to be put up in the challenge where inequity was the imbalance. We were ignored as people, and I think for a country to think about making the history right, this is a conversation of head and heart connect. We don't want 10 years' time or 20 years' time to have these conversations anymore. Our country is being destroyed. Our people have got no voice in this. So it's not about the Aboriginal people and the Australian people. It is us collectively. And I think the courageous thing that we've got to take on board with all of this is that for our hearts and our heads to connect, to understand the history of the exclusion of our people at the whim of government, at the whim of legislation, and at the whim of the Constitution, the rule book that governed this country for however long we have. We have been excluded all the way through. We have been dictated to in every part of what we've done. You know, the records, Sean, you probably got your own. The records of our families and our histories are in files. We can tell where our people walked because of those files. We were the most recorded people in history. And I think time now it is not about driving a wedge. It's about understanding the wedge that happened in Federation in that constitutional drafting. And we have to have the courage through this legal system that we all work in to start thinking about people and the human rights of Indigenous people in Australia.
Yeah.
Well said.
We have a few more questions, but I'm just conscious that we have run out of time. Perhaps to wrap it up, I could just ask each of the panellists where to from now. What can each of us do? Each of the people on this webinar and others who will watch it in the weeks and months ahead. What can we do to learn more about and participate and understand what it is that Aboriginal people are asking for and in this voice proposal?
Yeah. I think one thing from me
So
is
Carol, I'm just wondering, Carol, do you want perhaps Damien and myself to respond, and then you as a wrap-up respond, given that you're on country and yep.
Thank you, brother.
Yep. So yep. Damien, so do you want to answer that question? Then I'll follow you, and then we'll wrap up with Carol.
I mean, you know, I'm moved by what Carol just said, and the you know, and I've been dealing with this for 7 years, and I'm constantly reminded of how this really impinges on some people's lives in a deeply personal way, and that the situation of the law in this country has created real trauma for people on a very personal level. And I mean, we can't forget that, and we do need to attend to that and understand why we need to address that. I will say at the same time, I do think this is about finding common ground, and I think it's also about understanding that there are people of goodwill who are concerned about that, but who also believe that we need to uphold the Constitution, and we can't make an amendment to the Constitution that is going to affect the way the Constitution operates, so in a way that will make it less effective for all Australians. And so I believe this is possible, but I would say it is about listening to what the Indigenous people are asking for. It's also about saying, and then how can we find common ground? How can we address the range of concerns? Because I believe it is possible to do that, and I believe we can take this forward if we genuinely try to find the common ground here. Thanks. John.
Thank you, Damien. I think the most important thing from my perspective is that I've got to continually go back and acknowledge our old people, our ancestors, and constant fight over the many years to get us to this position. When you asked the questions early, Simon, in regards to the way in which we managed COVID, we managed it because our people fought for incremental change to empower ourselves, to ensure that we have Aboriginal controlled Aboriginal medical health services, to ensure that we have Aboriginal organisations that can respond and support our people when our people need it. During COVID, I really felt for non-Indigenous people. I felt for non-Indigenous people because you didn't have our networks. You didn't have our organisations to be able to respond and engage and lock down our communities. Not just lock down. Remember, our communities locked down well and truly before governments put lockdowns in place. We went into lockdown, but we fought for years and years and years to put structures in place to be able to support our communities at the times when they most need it. And COVID was the best example of just how well our kinship structures, our traditional structures actually worked. Because that's why our people were able to get through COVID with minimal impact to their health, because our old people have fought for these structures over a long period of time. And as I said, I really felt for non-Indigenous people because there's just not the same relationship with the organisations, with your Aboriginal, with your medical services, and how they engage. But I guess, where to from here? Indigenous people have done the heavy lifting. We are constantly doing the heavy lifting. It is time for non-Indigenous people who are supporters of what it is we're wanting to achieve to step up and to feel comfortable to step into this space. Yes, you may be challenged, and yes, you may, and someone may question why you're doing this. But I get challenged every day. I get questioned every day in regards to why we're doing this. And people, that's a part of it. Just becomes part and parcel of why we do it. But what I would encourage and urge people, non-Indigenous Australians, to step up and start carrying some of the workload. Start having the conversations with your networks, with the politicians, with all of those people that within your social space, within your workspaces, to bring them on this journey, because we can't do it alone. We're 3% of the population. We need 97% of the population to help us get this over the line and to get us to where we need to. I think that as we get to Indigenous constitutional recognition or anchoring the voice in, it will do more to bring this country together than it will do to divide us. Over to you, Carol. Thank you.
Thanks, Sean, and thanks, Damien. Thank you, Simon, for the invitation. I started this journey as a young teenager, watching my elders march. My mum and dad said, stop doing the marches because you'll end up in jail. Now I'm a grandmother still having this fight. We can't have reconciliation. We can't have uphold and recognise if we're not going to listen to our hearts and use the learnings, the years of learnings that you've all been through to help educate our population, to think about what we have suffered as Indigenous people against the odds some have risen. We can stand here and we can talk about this. But those old people, their voices are not here. But what they've taught us and given to Sean and I to stand and speak today is the strength and the fight that we have been ignored for too long. We have been spoken for, spoken about and spoken to. And the voice gives us the opportunity to have our own voices. The constitutional amendments, whatever it becomes and whatever it is, has to recognise us as the first people of this country. So whatever the words are, it doesn't matter to us as long as we are recognised in that constitution that we were written out of. Because the rule book has to change. How many times have the rule book changed in football? How many times has the rule book changed in netball? We have seen rule books change in state parliaments. We saw the big one happen here in Western Australia. And tonight is the last sleep I have before tomorrow. And hopefully we hear the court decision for the Noongar claim. Now I'm a grandmother waiting for that decision. So I think it's time. And I'm emotional about that. I've been counting down the sleeps till tomorrow. And whatever we get from this is going to be a sense of where this nation stands in the Western legal system. So thank you for participating today. And my heart is heavy and hopeful. But I was trying to dodge this bullet today, but we have to stand and talk and we have to share our voices with you to help you to understand that it's a fight of our existence. And our existence in this nation that we call home and what country means to us is a very different thing of what country means to many. So thank you. And thank you, brothers, Damien and Sean, for the support and sharing and coming back together. Sometimes I wish, we've adapted to this whole system of sharing and talking together, but COVID taught us many things. It is the resilience of where we are today, every single one of us. So it's not just our fight, it's everyone's fight. Thank you.
Thank you, Carol. It's back to me really to thank you and Sean and Damien and to everybody who's dialed into this today on behalf of Clayton Utz for again, helping us, educating us and inviting us to continue to join the journey towards reconciliation. I see two acknowledgements up there from two of the listeners that I think are well worth reading out to conclude this. Thank you, Sean and Carol, for speaking today and helping us all improve our understanding as we work towards reconciliation. I appreciate your courage on talking on such a personal issue. And then from one of my colleagues in our Sydney office, Bettina, thank you, Carol, for your clear expression of feeling and bringing us back to focus on the human rights of First Nations people. So, Carol, Sean and Damien, thank you once again for coming back and joining us. And thank you to everybody who dialed into this webinar today. And I hope everyone listening can take something positive away from this and become a bit better educated about the important issues that we've discussed. And we look forward to continuing the conversation going forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Simon.